My name is Lauren. For 12 months, my wealthy in-laws waged a calculated war to destroy my 18-year-old daughter's voice. They threatened to bankrupt my husband, they tried to fabricate a medical crisis to have her committed, and they hired corporate fixers to silence her on an international stage. They looked at a brilliant, driven young woman and only saw a liability to their country club image. But by the time they realized they were fighting a mother who keeps every single receipt, they had already lost their empire. Then, one afternoon, my father-in-law watched her speak at the United Nations on live television and tried to take credit for the very fire he tried to put out. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his legacy, welcome to Revenge Order. If a family has ever tried to make you shrink to fit their picture, you are in the right place. Please take a moment to like and subscribe and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from. I always love seeing the generations of strong women here. Now let me take you back to Buckhead, Georgia, the night the war officially started. The gold-embossed spine of the etiquette book slid across the mahogany dining table. It stopped 1 inch from my daughter's plate. The volume was a vintage edition bound in genuine leather, carrying the faint scent of dust and rigid expectations. "Women in our family speak softly, Chloe," my mother-in-law Evelyn said. She lifted her iced tea, the crystal clinking in the silent room. "And they certainly do not wear pantsuits to public forums. It comes across as strained." I sat across from them in the formal dining room of Evelyn and Richard's estate. The air conditioning in this house was always set to a chill matching the expressions of its owners. My daughter Chloe Alexandra sat beside me. She was a senior in high school and finalizing her preparations for the Atlanta Regional Debate on educational access. In a city built on a rich legacy of civil rights and youth leadership, Chloe was a natural force, but within these walls, she was expected to fade into the background. Chloe looked at the book, then met her grandmother's gaze. "It is a debate on resource allocation, grandmother. I need to command the room, not blend into the wallpaper." Evelyn's smile thinned into a pale, tight line. She directed her attention to my husband, David. "Your daughter is developing a sharp edge. You ought to smooth that out before college." David cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. Growing up in this estate had taught him early that survival meant quiet compliance. Before he could offer a placating apology, Richard leaned back at the head of the table. "My father-in-law built his real estate empire on handshakes and leveraged influence, and he wielded his wealth like a gavel." "Let us be clear," Richard said. His voice dropped into a measured cadence that signaled a warning. "I fund the college trust. I expect the beneficiary of that trust to reflect our values. If she insists on this public speaking tour, I will rethink where those funds are allocated." The room went still. The threat was not veiled. It was an invoice placed squarely on the table. Be quiet or be cut off. I am a nonprofit grant writer. My entire career is based on calculating margins and reading the fine print. I have learned over 20 years of marriage that raising your voice in this house simply gives them the reaction they crave. I reached out and picked up the heavy etiquette book. I felt the gold lettering under my thumb. Meeting Evelyn's eyes, I slid the book back across the polished mahogany, watching it stop against the base of her crystal glass. "Chloe's voice is her own," I said, keeping my tone level. "She will wear the suit." Richard's jaw tightened. David looked down at his plate. The rest of the dinner proceeded in the suffocating silence of Southern hospitality, where rage is served with a polite nod. An hour later, we prepared to depart. Chloe walked into the foyer to retrieve her backpack, which contained her handwritten debate outlines. I stepped into the hallway just as she unzipped the main compartment. A dark, sticky pool of liquid had soaked through the canvas. I reached into the bag and pulled out a stack of index cards. The ink was bleeding across the lines, turning weeks of late-night research into unreadable blue smears. The unmistakable scent of sweet tea wafted up from the ruined paper. Chloe stood frozen, her shoulders tense, staring at the destroyed work. Evelyn glided into the corridor, a damp cloth in her hand, her expression arranged into hollow dismay. "Oh, my word," she murmured. "I was bringing the pitcher back to the kitchen and lost my footing. I hope nothing important was in there." I looked at the tea-stained notes and then at Evelyn's pristine, spotless shoes. She had not tripped. She had fired the first shot. The drive back from Buckhead was wrapped in a suffocating silence. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, the dome light casting a faint glow over her lap where the ruined canvas backpack rested. She traced the edge of a tea-stained index card, her fingernail catching on the warped paper. I kept my eyes on the highway, my hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. We did not discuss Evelyn. We did not need to. The sabotage was a language we both understood perfectly. When we walked through our front door, David headed straight up the stairs, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his parents' expectations. I did not follow him. I took Chloe by the hand and led her to the kitchen island. I am a grant writer for nonprofit organizations. My professional survival depends on salvaging broken narratives and meeting impossible deadlines. I know how to build a case out of thin air. We spread the damp, smeared flashcards across the marble counter. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee while Chloe pulled up a blank document on her laptop. We stayed awake until 3 in the morning. I watched my daughter sift through the wreckage of her research. Where the ink had bled into illegible blue streaks, she relied on her memory. She pieced together statistics on educational funding disparities, rebuilding her arguments sentence by sentence. I sat across from her, editing for clarity, sharpening her transitions, and quietly marveling at her resilience. She did not cry over the ruined notes. She simply tightened her focus, channeling her frustration into a razor-sharp opening statement. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window shifted from pitch black to a bruised purple, the speech was not just restored, it was better. It was forged in defiance. A few hours later, the morning sun filtered through the blinds as we gathered our things in the hallway. David came downstairs, dressed in his weekend clothes, holding a mug of coffee. He looked at Chloe, taking in her tailored navy suit and the determined set of her jaw. He stepped forward, his expression caught somewhere between pride and deep-seated anxiety. "Chloe," David said, his voice dropping into a hesitant register, "you know how my father gets. He views everything as a reflection on his firm. When you get up on that stage today, maybe just soften the edges. Just tone it down a little. You can make your point without provoking them." He was trying to protect his livelihood, but he was doing it by asking his child to shrink. I stepped between them before Chloe could answer. I handed her the freshly printed speech. "Your daughter is going to speak her mind, David," I said, keeping my gaze steady on his. "She is not responsible for managing your father's fragile ego. We are going to the debate. We will see you there if you decide to come." I did not wait for his reply. I guided Chloe out the front door, leaving the quiet apologies behind us. Downtown Atlanta hums with a very different energy than the manicured lawns of the suburbs. The regional debate was held in an old university auditorium, a cavernous space filled with echoing voices, focused teenagers, and the electric tension of competition. It was a space dedicated to the progressive legacy of youth advocacy. We found our seats in the staging area, and Chloe ran through her breathing exercises. She was ready. 10 minutes before her flight was scheduled to begin, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. My stomach tightened. Richard and Evelyn walked down the center aisle. They had not been invited, and they had certainly never attended a debate tournament before. They did not sit in the back. They claimed 2 seats in the very front row, directly in the line of sight of the podium. Evelyn wore a pristine cream-colored dress, and Richard checked his watch with a look of profound boredom. They had come to unnerve her. When the moderator called Chloe to the stage, she walked up the steps with her head held high. She arranged her notes and adjusted the microphone. I watched from 3 rows back, my pulse thrumming in my ears. Chloe began her speech. Her voice rang out clear and authoritative, breaking down the systemic failures in local school district funding. She was flawless. Then Evelyn began her work. Right in the middle of Chloe's central argument regarding resource allocation, Evelyn leaned toward the woman sitting next to her. She raised her hand to her mouth, but she did not lower her voice. She delivered a loud, theatrical whisper. "It is just so abrasive." Evelyn said the words, carrying clearly over the quiet auditorium. "You would think someone would have taught her basic poise." Chloe heard it. I saw her grip on the edge of the podium tighten. Her rhythm faltered for a fraction of a second. She lost her place in a sentence, her eyes darting toward the front row. Richard sat back, a faint, satisfied smile playing on his lips. They thought they had won. They thought the old tricks of social shaming would silence the new generation, but they severely underestimated my daughter. Chloe took a single, measured breath. She let the silence stretch for 1 beat, then 2. She looked directly down at her grandmother, holding the eye contact, until Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then, Chloe bypassed her notes entirely. She launched back into her argument with a renewed, piercing clarity, delivering a staggering conclusion on the necessity of equity in education. She spoke with a conviction that could not be manufactured or bought. When she finished, the room erupted into genuine, sustained applause. Even the judges set down their pens to clap. We waited in the auditorium for an hour while the scores were tabulated. When the regional director finally took the stage, he announced the winner of the district title, the student who had secured the direct path to the United Nations Youth Delegate application. He called Chloe's name. I hugged her tightly, the relief washing over me. We had survived the sabotage. She had earned her place. As the crowd began to filter out toward the lobby, I glanced toward the front row. Evelyn was already walking toward the exit, her posture rigid, but Richard lingered near the stage. I watched as he approached the regional director of the debate league. I recognized the director from a local business profile. He ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, a firm that relied heavily on favorable zoning recommendations from Richard's development board. The two men shook hands. Richard leaned in close, speaking in a low, confidential tone. The director nodded quickly, his demeanor deferential and nervous. He glanced once toward the stage, then back to Richard, nodding again. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The victory suddenly felt fragile. I told Chloe to wait by the auditorium doors while I went to the registration tables in the lobby to collect her paperwork. Every advancing student was required to pick up their official advancement certificate, a formal document bearing the judge's signatures that served as the primary credential for the UN application. I reached the folding table where a volunteer was handing out the manila envelopes. I gave her Chloe's name and school district. The volunteer sifted through the alphabetized plastic bin. She frowned her fingers, tracing the empty space between the folders. She checked a secondary box on the floor, her brow furrowing deeper. "I am sorry," the volunteer said, looking up at me with genuine confusion. "I do not have a certificate here for Chloe Alexandra. The master list shows a clerical error regarding her eligibility points. It says her advancement is currently pending review by the regional director." I stood in the crowded lobby, the ambient noise fading into a dull roar. The paperwork had not been misplaced. It had been intercepted. My father-in-law had not just attended the debate to rattle a teenager. He had come to leverage his financial influence over a man who could not afford to say no. Richard was using his checkbook to erase my daughter's success before she could even fill out the application. I looked back toward the auditorium doors. Richard emerged from the shadows of the hallway, buttoning his suit jacket. He caught my eye across the crowded lobby. He did not smile. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent confirmation of his power, before turning and walking out into the bright Atlanta afternoon. The etiquette book and the spilled tea were only the beginning. The real war had just started. It took me 3 days of relentless phone calls and a threat of legal action to clear the clerical error Richard orchestrated at the regional debate. Once the director realized my documentation was flawless, Chloe received her advancement certificate. We submitted her application for the United Nations Youth Delegate program the following morning. Then the waiting began. During those tense weeks of late summer, a new pattern emerged. I began noticing small discrepancies around our home. A magazine subscription stopped arriving. A utility bill vanished before I could file it. Then our neighbor casually mentioned seeing Evelyn's luxury sedan parked in our driveway on Tuesday afternoons, right during the hours I was at the nonprofit office and David was at his consulting firm. Evelyn claimed she was dropping off fresh flowers or checking the security system, playing the role of the devoted matriarch. I knew better. I secure funding for a living by finding the gaps in audit trails. I know when a system is being tampered with. My mother-in-law was screening our mailbox. The realization sent a cold prickle down my spine. They were treating our home like an extension of their corporate holdings, monitoring our correspondence to maintain their grip on Chloe's future. I started leaving work early, altering my route to catch the postal carrier, but Evelyn was always one step ahead, armed with her spare key and her weaponized hospitality. The UN Selection Committee informed candidates that official decisions would arrive by certified mail in early September. On a crisp Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with an automated tracking update. I had set up alerts the moment we mailed the application. The notification displayed 4 simple words: delivered and signed for. I left my office immediately. The drive to our suburban neighborhood felt endless. The Georgia heat shimmered off the asphalt, mirroring the rising tension in my chest. When I pulled into the driveway, the red flag on our mailbox was lowered. I opened the metal door, expecting to find the rigid cardboard envelope holding my daughter's future. The box was empty. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who do not have a plan. I pulled out my phone and accessed the Postal Service delivery portal. I requested the proof of signature image. The digital screen loaded, revealing a looping, elegant cursive scrawl on the electronic receipt. It was a signature I had seen on dozens of passive-aggressive holiday cards and restrictive trust fund documents. Evelyn. She had intercepted the delivery. The audacity of the act was staggering, yet entirely consistent with their belief that the rules did not apply to them. They viewed Chloe's ambition not as a triumph, but as a liability to be managed. I turned my car around and merged onto the highway heading toward Buckhead. The wrought iron gates of Richard and Evelyn's estate swung open as I punched in the family code. I parked behind Evelyn's pristine sedan, walked up the brick steps, and let myself through the front door. The house was silent, smelling of lemon polish and old money. I found Evelyn in the sunroom, arranging hydrangeas in a heavy crystal vase. She wore a silk blouse and looked up with an expression of mild, manufactured surprise. "Lauren," she said, clipping a stem with silver shears, "we did not expect you. David usually calls ahead." "Where is the envelope, Evelyn?" I asked. My voice was calm, anchored in the certainty of the digital receipt stored in my pocket. I refused to grant her the satisfaction of seeing me unraveled. She did not drop the shears. Her hands remained remarkably steady. "I have no idea what you are referencing. I stopped by your house earlier to leave a casserole in the refrigerator. I brought the mail inside so it would not sit out in the heat. You should be thanking me." "A piece of certified mail was delivered today. You signed for it." Evelyn offered a dismissive wave of her hand, turning her attention back to the flowers. "Oh, that. It looked like solicitations. You know how those political organizations mask their fundraising materials. I tossed a stack of junk mail into the recycling bin on my way out. I was doing you a favor, darling. Your kitchen counter is always so cluttered." It was a lie delivered with the flawless polish of Southern gentility. She wanted me to raise my voice. She wanted me to tear through her recycling bin like a frantic animal searching for scraps while she watched with cool detachment. I did neither. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes scan the room. I analyzed the space with the same cold precision I used to review a budget proposal. My gaze drifted from the floral arrangement to the mahogany side table near the study doors. Richard's leather briefcase sat on the polished wood. The brass clasps were undone. Poking out from beneath a stack of financial reports was a distinct corner of thick, textured blue paper. It was the exact shade of the United Nations emblem. I stepped past Evelyn and walked directly to the table. "Excuse me?" Evelyn snapped, dropping her shears onto the marble counter. "You do not pry through Richard's belongings. That is highly inappropriate." I ignored her, reaching into the briefcase and pulling out the blue envelope. It bore Chloe's name in crisp black typeface. I turned it over. The adhesive seal on the back flap was warped and peeling. The paper rippled with faint water damage. They had steamed it open. I slid my fingers under the loose flap and pulled out the heavy cream letterhead. My eyes scanned the first paragraph. The selection committee praised Chloe's compelling regional performance. They commended her unyielding perspective on global educational access. She was officially invited to speak as a delegate in New York City. She had won, and they had tried to steal it. I held the letter, feeling the weight of the paper and the magnitude of the betrayal. They were willing to extinguish their granddaughter's brightest moment just to keep the family portrait looking uniform. The heavy oak doors of the study clicked open. Richard stepped into the sunroom. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his expression as hard and unreadable as granite. He looked at the letter in my hand, then at his wife, registering the breach in their defense. He did not look embarrassed. He looked inconvenienced. "You have a habit of trespassing, Lauren," Richard said, buttoning his jacket. "That envelope was brought here for safekeeping. We were discussing how best to handle the situation." "The situation is that my daughter earned a seat on an international stage," I replied, carefully folding the letter and placing it into my purse. "And you committed a federal offense to intercept her mail." Richard took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. The polite veneer he usually maintained around the family dissolved, revealing the ruthless pragmatist underneath. He was a man accustomed to buying silence and paving over obstacles. "No granddaughter of mine will humiliate this family by standing at a podium and spouting radical talking points to the global press," Richard said. His voice was low, devoid of warmth. "She represents my legacy. I will not fund her defection, and I will not permit her to use our name to attack the very institutions that built her comfortable life." I met his stare, refusing to step back. "You do not own her. Her voice belongs to her." Richard tilted his head, a cold calculation settling over his features. "Perhaps not, but I own David." The words hung in the chilled air of the sunroom, heavy and toxic. "Your husband's consulting firm relies on a very specific line of credit," Richard continued, his tone conversational and lethal. "A loan I personally guaranteed when he wanted to play business owner. The terms of that agreement allow me to call the principal due at my discretion. If Chloe accepts this invitation, I will call the debt tomorrow morning. David will be bankrupt before the weekend." He reached out and adjusted a stray hydrangea leaf in his wife's face, a casual gesture contrasting the devastation he had just promised. "Tell Chloe to decline the offer, Lauren, or tell David to pack his office." The digital chime of an incoming email pierced the quiet of our kitchen the following morning. The early Georgia sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting long shadows across the marble island. I stood by the counter, pouring a cup of dark roast coffee, when David opened the message on his tablet. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He set the device down, his hands trembling slightly, and began to pace the length of the hardwood floor. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. Richard had not waited for a response to his ultimatum. He had instructed his corporate attorneys to execute the demand clause. The formal letter required full repayment of the startup capital provided to David's consulting firm within 48 hours. The sum was staggering, a figure designed to induce ruin rather than collect a debt. "He did it," David whispered, rubbing his temples as he walked back and forth from the sink to the refrigerator. "He actually called the note. Lauren, if I do not wire those funds by Friday, they will seize the commercial lease. They will liquidate my client accounts. Everything I have built for the last 10 years will be gone." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading. Growing up under Richard's shadow had left David with a deep conditioned reflex to fold under pressure. The fear in his voice was palpable, a testament to decades of engineered dependency. He was a successful man reduced to a frightened boy by a single email. "Lauren, we have to pause this," he said, his voice tightening with desperation. "Just for a year. Tell Chloe she can reapply to the Delegate program when she is in college. Ask her to wait before doing this political stuff. We cannot lose our entire livelihood over one speech." I set my coffee mug on the counter. The ceramic clinked against the stone, a sharp, defining sound in the tense room. I looked at my husband, understanding his terror, but refusing to validate it. "Her voice is not currency," I said, my tone unwavering. "I will not let you pay your father's ransom with our daughter's future." "It is just a delay," he pleaded, gesturing wildly toward the tablet on the counter. "It is practical. It is how things work in the real world." "It is surrender," I corrected him, holding his gaze until he looked away. "And if we teach her to yield now, she will spend the rest of her life asking men like your father for permission to speak. I will not allow it. We will find another way." I left David in the kitchen and walked down the hall to my home office. I shut the heavy oak door, locking it behind me, and turned on the brass desk lamp. As a nonprofit grant writer, my daily survival hinges on forensic accounting. I spend my life dissecting budgets, identifying hidden clauses, and tracking the flow of capital through complex organizational structures. I know how to dismantle a financial trap. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick binders containing David's business incorporation documents and our personal financial portfolios. I spread the paperwork across my desk, creating a timeline of transactions. For the next 3 hours, I read every line, every addendum, and every footnote. What I found was not a standard familial investment. It was a snare. Richard had structured the consulting firm loan as a predatory instrument. The interest rates compounded uniquely, utilizing a variable index that favored the lender under any market condition. Worse, the collateral covenants were tied not just to the business assets, but to our personal residence. It bordered on sheer financial coercion, designed specifically to keep his son in a state of perpetual subjugation. David had signed the papers years ago, trusting his father, never realizing he was placing his own neck in a noose. The betrayal deepened as I turned my attention to the college trust fund. Richard had always held that account over Chloe's head, using it to enforce dress codes and mandate holiday attendance. I sifted through the original trust declarations, tracing the legal jargon down the page. Buried on the 17th page, under a section detailing fiduciary responsibilities, was a discretionary revocation clause. It granted the primary benefactor the unilateral right to drain the account to zero without penalty notice or justification. We were not just tethered to a tyrant, we were collateral. Every aspect of our livelihood was legally encumbered by a man who viewed his family as disposable subsidiaries. Instead of breaking down, a cold, crystalline focus settled over me. Panic serves no purpose when the house is already on fire. You simply have to find the exit. I opened my laptop and navigated to a secure, encrypted banking portal. Over the past decade, I had maintained a quiet, independent savings account. It was a habit formed from years of observing the restrictive dynamics of my in-laws. I had funneled small freelance writing bonuses, tax returns, and minor windfalls into this separate ledger. David never asked about my independent contracts, and I never volunteered the ledger's existence. The balance was modest, but it was entirely free from Richard's reach. Right now, it was our only lifeline. I initiated a series of rapid electronic transfers. I moved every unencumbered dollar from our joint checking account into my independent vault. I paid off the outstanding balances on 2 credit cards, ensuring we had open lines of credit that Richard could not freeze. Then I navigated to an airline website. I purchased 2 round-trip tickets to New York City and reserved a room at a hotel near the United Nations headquarters, ensuring our proximity to the summit. I paid for everything in full, securing the logistics of Chloe's trip before the impending financial freeze could take effect. The quiet rebellion of routing those funds felt like drawing a breath of clean air after years of suffocation. I was building a firewall around my daughter, brick by financial brick. With the travel arrangements secured, I returned to the physical paperwork on my desk to organize the files. I gathered the consulting firm contracts, slipping them back into their manila folders. I needed to hide the evidence of my audit before David came looking for me. As I reached for a stack of David's recent correspondence, a thick, cream-colored document slipped from the middle of the pile and landed on the hardwood floor. It was printed on the distinct heavy cardstock used by Richard's corporate legal team. I picked it up, and my eyes scanning the bold heading at the top of the page. It was a draft petition for the county probate court. I read the text, my blood turning to ice. The document was a formal request for a temporary conservatorship over Chloe Alexandra. The filing cited severe emotional instability, erratic behavioral changes, and a danger to her own academic future. They had twisted her passionate debate performances into fabricated symptoms of a manic episode. The petition proposed granting full medical and legal decision-making authority to her grandparents, effectively stripping David and me of our parental rights and placing Chloe under Richard's direct control. They were not merely trying to bankrupt us. They were preparing to fabricate a mental health crisis to legally seize my child. They intended to label her drive for advocacy as a psychological breakdown, using their wealth to purchase a court order that would silence her permanently. The polite skirmishes over etiquette books and tea-stained notes were over. The gloves were off and the real war had arrived. The draft petition for conservatorship remained locked in my bottom drawer, a silent testament to Richard's ruthless strategy. Financial extortion was merely an opening move to test our defenses. The true objective was character assassination. In the insulated, manicured enclaves of Buckhead, reputation serves as the only currency that matters. Evelyn began her work at the country club luncheons and charity galas. She did not raise her voice in public. She utilized the lethal weapon of feigned concern. Leaning across linen tablecloths, she whispered to the wives of local judges and corporate board members about Chloe's sudden, worrying intensity. She framed my daughter's passion for global education not as a civic virtue, but as a mental health crisis. She painted a vivid picture of a fragile girl buckling under the pressure of her own delusions. The rumors moved with the efficiency of a virus, infecting the very institutions that were supposed to protect her. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was the headmaster of Chloe's private high school. Richard had funded the new athletic center wing 5 years ago, purchasing a permanent shadow over the administration. I sat in the headmaster's office an hour later, the leather chair squeaking slightly in the stifling quiet. He folded his hands on his expansive mahogany desk, wearing a mask of practiced empathy. "We are just worried about Chloe's equilibrium," he said, deploying that clinical, detached vocabulary designed to sound supportive while accomplishing the exact opposite. "Her recent debate performances have been remarkably charged. Given the murmurs in the community regarding her well-being, the board believes a brief leave of absence might be beneficial. A chance to rest, perhaps, step away from this upcoming trip to New York. We want to protect her academic future." I looked at the framed architectural rendering of the Richard and Evelyn Athletic Center hanging on the wall behind his head. The transaction was glaringly obvious. "My daughter maintains a flawless grade point average," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "Her debate scores are the highest in the district. You are not protecting her academic future. You are protecting your endowment. Chloe will attend the summit, and she will attend her classes. If you attempt to penalize her attendance, I will bring the state accreditation board into this office by Friday morning." I walked out before he could formulate a response. The realization settled heavily on my shoulders as I crossed the parking lot. Richard and Evelyn were constructing a barricade of institutional concern, laying the groundwork for a judge to look at that conservatorship petition and see a documented pattern of instability. I drove straight from the school toward the nonprofit office, my mind cataloging every vulnerability they could exploit next. If they were targeting her education, her medical history was the logical next step. I pulled my car to the side of the road, dialing the family pediatric clinic we had used since Chloe was an infant. The receptionist answered, her tone hesitant, when I identified myself. "I was actually just about to call you, Lauren," the receptionist said, lowering her voice. "Evelyn was here an hour ago. She requested a copy of Chloe's entire file. She stated there was a severe family emergency, that Chloe was exhibiting dangerous behavioral shifts, and that David was too distraught to handle the paperwork." My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. Evelyn had physically walked into the clinic, utilizing the trust built over 18 years of bringing Chloe to routine checkups to steal her private medical history. She was searching for any minor note, any prescribed anxiety medication, or passing teenage struggle to weaponize in a courtroom setting. "Did you give her the file?" I asked, forcing the words through a tight throat. "No," the receptionist said quickly. "Chloe turned 18 last month. The system flagged the request. I told Evelyn she needed a signed release from Chloe herself. She left, but she was furious. She said Richard would be contacting the clinic director." I did not drive to my office. I stayed in the car and drafted a formal legal directive. I dictated it over the phone to the clinic manager, citing specific violations of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I stated that any unauthorized release of information to Richard or Evelyn would result in immediate, devastating litigation that would cost the attending physicians their medical licenses. I then spent the next 2 hours contacting Chloe's school registrar, her debate coaches, and her bank. I erected a fortress of privacy blocks, revoking all secondary access permissions. I systematically severed the grandparents from every institutional record of my daughter's existence. When I arrived home that evening, the house felt like a bunker under siege. David was sequestered in his home office, frantically trying to restructure his consulting contracts to survive the impending financial ruin his father had triggered. Chloe sat on the living room sofa, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her debate binder sat untouched on the coffee table. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. The whisper campaign had reached her peers. The toxic text messages and the sudden polite distance from her classmates were taking a heavy toll. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking, "is this worth it?" I sat down beside her, the cushion sinking under my weight. I waited for her to continue, knowing she needed to vocalize the fear. "Dad is going to lose his business," she whispered, a tear tracing the curve of her cheek. "Grandma is telling everyone I'm having a breakdown. People are actually looking at me differently. Maybe they are right. Maybe I am just being selfish. I could just withdraw the application. We could go back to normal." Normal. The word hung in the air, a hollow and dangerous promise. Normal meant smiling through the insults. Normal meant trading your authenticity for a funded college trust. Normal was a slow, quiet suffocation. I reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. I did not offer empty platitudes. "Look at me, Chloe," I said, my tone gentle but unyielding. "The people who love you want to hear your voice. The people who want to control you will call your voice a symptom of an illness. They are terrified of you. They are terrified because they built their entire empire on the assumption that everyone has a price, and they just discovered that you do not." She sniffled, resting her head on my shoulder. "A family that demands your silence in exchange for their support is not a family," I told her, staring at the darkening window panes. "It is a cage, and we do not go back into the cage just because the lock is familiar. You are going to New York. You are going to stand at that podium, and you are going to tell the truth. Let them burn their own reputation trying to stop you." I felt her take a deep, steadying breath. The tension in her shoulders began to unwind. The resolve returned to her posture, forged stronger by the friction of their betrayal. I left her to review her speech and retreated to my desk to check my work emails. My inbox was a stream of mundane grant approvals and budget queries. At the very top of the list sat an unread message from an encrypted, anonymous address. The subject line was blank. I clicked the message. The body contained a single sentence typed by someone who clearly understood the gravity of the internal politics at Richard's real estate firm. "They are planning to get ahead of the narrative." Attached to the email was a digital document. I downloaded the file and opened it on my screen. It was a drafted press release formatted on Richard's corporate letterhead, slated for distribution to the local Atlanta media outlets on the morning of the United Nations Summit. The headline read, "Local philanthropist disavows granddaughter's unauthorized statements, cites ongoing health struggles." The text was a masterpiece of corporate spin. It framed Chloe's upcoming speech as a tragic, unauthorized outburst fueled by emotional instability. The document effectively severed her from the family legacy while preserving Richard's image as a heartbroken, supportive patriarch dealing with a troubled youth. They were not just trying to stop her from speaking, they were preparing to publicly humiliate her while she was standing on the international stage. The anonymous email containing the drafted press release sat in my inbox like an unexploded shell. I printed a physical copy, locking it in my desk drawer, alongside the fraudulent conservatorship petition. Richard and Evelyn were preparing to disavow Chloe the moment she stepped onto the international stage, but they needed her to get there first. With the United Nations Summit only 3 weeks away, their tactics shifted overnight. The whisper campaign about my daughter's mental health faded, replaced suddenly by an overwhelming, suffocating deployment of Southern hospitality. The invitation arrived by courier on thick, cream-colored cardstock. It announced a formal send-off dinner in honor of our daughter's upcoming trip to New York. The guest list included the extended family local board members and several prominent state politicians. They were setting a public stage. Refusing to attend would only feed the narrative that Chloe was erratic and estranged. We had to walk directly into the snare. On the morning of the dinner, a second courier arrived at our house carrying a garment bag from a high-end boutique. Inside was a dress Evelyn had purchased for Chloe to wear that evening. I unzipped the bag and pulled out the garment. It was a pale pink, high-collared, ankle-length dress that looked like it belonged to a different century. It was designed to diminish the wearer to make a young woman look fragile, compliant, and decorative. A handwritten note on Evelyn's personalized stationery was pinned to the collar. It read, "To ensure you present a proper Georgia image tonight." Chloe stared at the dress hanging from the door frame. She did not cry. The tears had stopped weeks ago, replaced by a hardened resolve. She reached into her own closet and pulled out the sharp, tailored navy suit she had worn to win the regional debate. She buttoned the blazer, adjusted her collar, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a professional, ready to command a room. She folded the pink dress, placed it back into the garment bag, and laid it on her bed. We would not play their game. The Buckhead estate was ablaze with lights when we pulled into the circular driveway. Valets rushed to open doors, and the faint sound of a string quartet drifted from the open French doors of the terrace. We walked into the foyer, bracing for the impact. Evelyn met us near the grand staircase. She wore an emerald silk gown, holding a glass of champagne. Her eyes darted over Chloe's tailored suit, and her smile faltered, her jaw clenching tight. She had orchestrated this evening to display a subdued, obedient granddaughter to her political allies. Instead, Chloe walked in looking like an equal. "That is an interesting sartorial choice," Evelyn noted, her tone dripping with passive condescension. "I assumed my gift would have been a better fit for the occasion." "The suit fits perfectly, grandmother," Chloe replied, her voice unwavering. "Thank you for the thought." Evelyn turned sharply, leading us into the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set for 20 guests. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the fine china and polished silver. I recognized a state senator seated near the center, along with 2 wealthy donors who heavily funded Richard's real estate ventures. The room hummed with the quiet transactional conversations of the elite. We took our assigned seats, flanked by people who smiled at us while silently assessing our net worth. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological tension. Courses of roasted quail and buttered asparagus were served by silent catering staff. We navigated the polite, hollow inquiries about the upcoming trip to New York. Then, as the plates were cleared for dessert, Richard tapped his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low chatter, bringing the room to immediate silence. Richard stood at the head of the table. He wore his bespoke tuxedo with practiced ease, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch. He spoke about the legacy of our family, the duty of guiding the next generation, and the pride he felt for his granddaughter's academic achievements. It was a flawless performance, calibrated precisely for the politicians sitting at his table. "As many of you know," Richard said, his voice projecting across the dining room, "Chloe will be speaking at the United Nations Youth Summit next month. It is a significant platform. To ensure her message reflects the values of our community, Evelyn and I have taken the liberty of utilizing our corporate public relations team to refine her remarks." He gestured to the catering staff lining the walls. On cue, the waiters stepped forward holding stacks of cream-colored folders. They began distributing a folder to every guest at the table, placing them deliberately next to the dessert forks. Evelyn smiled brightly at the state senator. "We want to ensure she presents a cohesive, respectful perspective," she explained. "Chloe will be delivering this approved text in New York." I opened the folder placed in front of me. The document inside was a sanitized, hollow shell of my daughter's original work. They had stripped away every mention of systemic inequality, educational funding disparities, and youth advocacy. They had replaced her fierce, brilliant arguments with vague platitudes praising corporate philanthropy and traditional values. It was a speech designed to promote Richard's business interests under the guise of youth leadership. I looked across the table at David. My husband sat frozen in his chair, staring down at the fraudulent document. The lifelong conditioning of this house had triggered his paralysis. He was caught in the suffocating grip of his father's authority, unable to speak, unable to defend his own child. I did not wait for him to break the spell. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. Raising my voice would only provide them with the narrative of the hysterical daughter-in-law. Instead, I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor echoed in the quiet room. I picked up my folder, closed it, and stepped away from my seat. I walked to the guest sitting to my left, a prominent local developer, and calmly slipped the folder out from under his hands. "Excuse me," I said softly, offering a polite smile. I continued around the long mahogany table. My footsteps were measured and deliberate. I took the folder from the state senator. I took the folder from Evelyn's closest friend. I moved from seat to seat, quietly collecting the fabricated speeches. The guests watched me in stunned, uncomfortable silence. No one tried to stop me. The sheer audacity of my calm defiance paralyzed the room. When I reached the head of the table, I held a thick stack of cream-colored folders. I stood directly in front of Richard. His face had flushed a dark, dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck pulsed against his crisp white collar. I turned toward the corner of the dining room where a large silver refuse bin had been placed for the catering staff to discard soiled napkins. I walked over, lifted the lid, and dropped the entire stack of folders into the trash. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the bottom of the metal bin sounded like a gavel striking a block. I turned back to face the silent room. "Chloe writes her own words," I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the dining room. "She does not require a corporate public relations team to speak the truth. Thank you for your concern." The silence that followed was suffocating. The state senator stared at his empty dessert plate. Evelyn's jaw dropped, her carefully constructed mask slipping to reveal pure, unfiltered shock. Richard did not look at me. He turned his burning gaze directly toward David, who was still sitting in his chair. Richard's voice was low, lethal, and devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the voice of a man liquidating a failed asset. "You are finished," Richard told his son, speaking loud enough for the politicians to witness the execution. "Your consulting firm is hereby severed from my portfolio. Your contracts are terminated. Do not ever ask me for a line of credit again. You chose to let this happen in my house. Now you will face the ruin you earned." David looked at his father. He looked at the powerful guests who were currently pretending not to watch his public destruction. Then he looked across the table at Chloe, who sat tall and unflinching in her navy suit. Finally, he looked at me, standing by the refuse bin, waiting for him to make a choice. The spell broke. The decades of fear and compliance shattered under the weight of his father's cruelty. David stood up. He buttoned his jacket, his hands steady. He did not shrink. He looked at the man who had controlled his entire existence and simply nodded. "Keep your money," David said, his voice echoing in the grand dining room. "We do not want it." He walked around the table, extending his hand to Chloe. She took it, rising from her chair. He wrapped his other arm around my waist, and together the three of us turned our backs on the silent gilded room. We walked out of the formal dining room, through the grand foyer, and out the heavy front doors into the humid Georgia night. We left the inheritance, the status, and the suffocating strings behind us. We had lost our financial safety net, but as we walked down the brick steps toward our car, I knew we had won the only thing that mattered. We had our freedom. The silence in our house the morning after the Buckhead dinner felt entirely different from any quiet we had known before. It was not the suffocating stillness of walking on eggshells to appease a tyrant. It was the stark, echoing reality of a severed tether. David sat at the kitchen table methodically cataloging his remaining consulting clients. He drafted emails from a personal account, his corporate server access having been revoked by his father's IT department sometime during the night. He had chosen his wife and daughter, and the price of that choice was total financial excommunication. With our social and economic bridges burned, our focus narrowed to a single, unyielding objective. We had to get Chloe to New York City. The logistics of the trip became my sole priority. I sat at my desk, opening my laptop to confirm our flight upgrades and pay the hotel deposit. I navigated to the airline portal and entered the digits of the primary joint credit card David and I had used for years. The screen spun for a moment, then flashed a sharp red error message: "Transaction denied." I furrowed my brow and reached into my wallet for a secondary card. I entered the billing details. Denied. I picked up my phone and called the bank's customer service line. After holding for 10 tense minutes, a representative informed me that a comprehensive fraud alert had been placed on our entire portfolio early that morning. The hold originated from the primary guarantor's office. Richard had weaponized his foundational status on David's original accounts to freeze every liquid asset we shared. He intended to strand us in Georgia, clipping our wings just days before the summit. I thanked the representative and ended the call. I did not give in to fear. Panic is a useless emotion when the objective is clear. The independent vault I had nurtured for a decade was insulated from Richard's reach, but I knew better than to rely on electronic transfers that his lawyers might attempt to flag or intercept. I drove to a local branch of a different bank, an institution entirely unaffiliated with my father-in-law's sprawling real estate empire. I withdrew the necessary travel funds in crisp, untraceable bills. From the bank, I drove directly to the airline counter at the local terminal. I paid for our flight incidentals and the hotel retainer in physical currency. The ticket agent looked surprised to process such a large cash transaction, but physical currency leaves no digital vulnerability for a billionaire to exploit. I secured the printed boarding passes and slipped them into my purse. 2 days later, the morning of our departure arrived. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport is a sprawling, chaotic hub of transient energy. The humid Georgia air outside gave way to the frantic, echoing rush of the departure hall. We carried our luggage through the sliding glass doors, keeping our steps brisk and purposeful. I handed Chloe her boarding pass as we approached the security checkpoint. I glanced at the thick cardstock and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. A bold, dark SSSS was stamped across the top right corner of her ticket. Secondary Security Screening Selection. We joined the standard security queue, placing our items in the gray plastic bins. Almost immediately, 2 Transportation Security Administration officers stepped forward, bypassing a dozen other passengers. They pointed directly at Chloe and me, pulling us out of the line and directing us toward a stainless steel partition isolated from the main checkpoint. The primary officer, a stern woman with a tight jaw, demanded our identification. She began unpacking our carry-on bags with rough, invasive efficiency. She swabbed the linings of our suitcases, opened every zippered compartment, and spread Chloe's carefully organized debate materials across the metal table. The delay was deliberate and consuming. Minutes ticked away, inching closer to our boarding time. I turned my head toward the concourse walkway, surveying the crowd of morning commuters. Leaning against a concrete structural pillar, wearing a nondescript gray suit, was a man I recognized instantly. He was the head of risk management for Richard's corporate firm, a private security contractor who handled my father-in-law's more delicate logistical problems. He held a phone to his ear, his eyes fixed intently on our screening process. Richard had utilized his extensive network of law enforcement connections and corporate favors to flag our travel profiles. He was using federal security protocols as a weapon to make us miss the flight. I felt the familiar sharp heat of anger rising in my throat. I took a step forward, ready to challenge the officer and demand a supervisor. I was prepared to tear the partition down to get my daughter on that plane. Before I could speak, Chloe stepped in front of me. She placed a gentle hand on my arm, signaling me to wait. She turned to face the officer. She did not raise her voice, nor did she display a single ounce of frustration. Instead, she employed the exact skills that had won her the regional debate title. She addressed the officer by the name printed on her badge, establishing immediate polite rapport. She articulated our itinerary clearly and offered to demonstrate the electronics without being asked. She spoke with a calm, methodical logic, her tone conveying respect while simultaneously asserting her rights. Chloe treated the hostile screening not as an insult, but as a rigid structure she could navigate through sheer poise. The officer, clearly braced for a hostile confrontation from a delayed passenger, found herself disarmed by the profound maturity of an 18-year-old girl. The invasive search slowed into a routine procedural check. Chloe answered every inquiry with sharp, concise accuracy. She dismantled the tension in the space, word by word. The officer zipped the bags, handed back our identification, and offered a curt nod. Her demeanor had been entirely neutralized. We were cleared. I glanced toward the concrete pillar. The contractor lowered his phone, his expression souring as we gathered our belongings and walked away from the partition. We headed toward the concourse train. We did not run, refusing to give Richard's watcher the satisfaction of seeing our panic. We maintained a swift, dignified pace riding the escalators down to the departure gates. We reached our gate just as the final boarding group was called over the loudspeaker. The agent scanned our passes, and we walked down the jet bridge, the heavy air conditioning cooling the adrenaline still humming in my veins. We found our seats near the wing. I buckled my belt, listening to the safety briefing and feeling the deep vibration of the engines humming through the floorboards. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, taxiing toward the runway. As the plane accelerated and the wheels lifted off the Georgia tarmac, leaving the manicured estates and the suffocating control of Buckhead far below us, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Evelyn. It contained 5 simple words: "You can't outrun family." I stared at the glowing screen for a moment, absorbing the threat. I did not reply. I switched the device to airplane mode and slipped it back into my bag. I looked over at Chloe, who was already reviewing her speech notes on her tablet, her focus unbreakable. We were out of their airspace. The New York battle had begun. The descent into LaGuardia Airport brought a profound shift in the atmosphere. We traded the stifling heavy humidity of Georgia for the sharp electric energy of New York City. The transition felt deeply symbolic. We had left behind the suffocating constraints of the Buckhead estate and entered a landscape defined by towering ambition and relentless motion. Our cab wove through the dense traffic of Manhattan, the towering glass facades reflecting the fading afternoon light. Chloe sat beside me in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the crowded sidewalks and the endless stream of pedestrians. Her posture had shifted during the flight. The defensive tension she carried in Atlanta had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, determined focus. She was no longer bracing for an attack. She was preparing for a presentation. We arrived at the boutique hotel located just a few blocks from the United Nations headquarters. The lobby smelled of expensive cedar and polished brass, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the airport. I approached the reception desk, setting my leather tote bag on the marble counter. I provided the clerk with my identification and the booking reference number. The young man typed on his keyboard, his brow furrowing as he reviewed the digital ledger. He clicked his mouse several times, his expression shifting into a mask of professional apology. "I am sorry, ma'am," the clerk said, keeping his voice low out of respect for the surrounding guests. "It appears your reservation was canceled early this morning by the primary account holder. We do not have any rooms available for the remainder of the week. The city is fully booked for the summit." Evelyn and Richard were still trying to execute their logistical siege. They had tracked the original booking attempt and used their corporate travel concierge to authorize a cancellation. They wanted us out on the street, exhausted, distracted, and desperate for lodging. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg the clerk for a favor or explain our family dynamics. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the thick, embossed envelope I had secured from the local bank prior to our departure. I opened the clasp and laid the physical, printed receipts flat on the marble counter. I placed the confirmation of my cash payment directly over his keyboard, ensuring the bold print was undeniable. "The initial reservation was flagged due to a banking error," I explained, maintaining a steady, unyielding tone. "However, as you can see on this time-stamped receipt, the room was secured and paid in full using physical currency at your sister property in Atlanta 2 days ago. The transaction is complete. The room belongs to us. I suggest you call your manager to clear the digital error before we discuss the legal implications of denying a fully compensated guest their lodging." The clerk looked at the crisp paper, then up at my face. He recognized the tone of someone who would not be moved by bureaucratic hurdles. He picked up his desk phone, spoke briefly to a supervisor, and spent 2 minutes typing rapidly into the system. He printed a set of key cards and slid them across the counter with a polite nod. We took the elevator to the 12th floor. Chloe dropped her suitcase on the carpet and walked straight to the window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. We had secured our foothold in hostile territory. The following morning arrived with a sharp, clear sky. We walked the short distance to the United Nations headquarters, joining a stream of young delegates, international officials, and eager journalists. The sheer scale of the complex was intimidating. A sea of colorful flags snapped in the brisk wind along First Avenue, representing the global scale of the event. We cleared the initial security checkpoints and entered the cavernous main lobby. The space buzzed with an intersection of languages and diplomatic fervor. Chloe directed us toward the Delegate Registration Pavilion. She joined a line of international students, her debate binder tucked securely under her arm. I stood a few paces back, observing the flow of the crowd to ensure our perimeter remained secure. A woman wearing a tailored charcoal suit walked purposefully across the polished stone floor. She carried a sleek leather clipboard and bypassed the main registration queue, heading straight toward my daughter. She possessed the polished, neutral demeanor of a corporate operative. "Chloe Alexandra," the woman said, extending a hand adorned with an expensive silver watch. "I am so glad I found you before the initial orientation begins. My name is Diane Caldwell. I am the regional chaperone appointed by the Georgia Educational Board. I am here to guide your media interactions today and ensure your talking points align with our state standards." Chloe hesitated, her hand hovering over the clipboard Diane extended. I recognized the name instantly. Diane Caldwell was not an educational liaison. She was a senior crisis manager at my father-in-law's real estate development firm. Richard had hired a professional corporate fixer to intercept my daughter on the floor of the United Nations. He intended to control her press access feed, her sanitized talking points, and quarantine her from any authentic media engagement. I stepped forward, inserting myself smoothly between the fixer and my daughter. I did not smile. "You are not affiliated with the Georgia Educational Board," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby. "You are an employee of Richard Alexandra, and your presence here is unauthorized." Diane blinked, her professional veneer slipping for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, lowering her clipboard. I am here in an official advisory capacity to assist the regional delegates. It is standard procedure for out-of-state participants. It is a targeted interception, I corrected her. I opened my purse. During the frantic hours I spent severing my in-laws from Chloe's medical and academic records back in Georgia, I had also visited a notary. I pulled out a rigid legal document printed on thick parchment paper. It was a formal injunction drafted by my personal attorney, explicitly stripping all unauthorized personnel from Chloe's official liaison list. It granted me sole legal guardianship and media proxy rights for the duration of the summit. I held the document up, ensuring Diane could read the bold legal seal stamped at the bottom of the page. This is a binding legal directive, I explained, keeping my voice low enough to avoid drawing a crowd, but firm enough to convey my intent. You have no legal standing to approach a minor delegate. If you attempt to speak to my daughter again, I will signal the United Nations security detail standing 20 feet behind you and have you removed for harassing a registered participant. Diane looked at the notarized signature, then at the armed guards stationed near the entrance. She calculated the risk and realized the parameters had changed. She could not buy her way out of a federal security incident. She offered a tight, forced nod, turned on her heel, and walked briskly out of the expansive lobby. I placed the document back into my purse. Chloe let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping in relief. We retrieved her official delegate badge from the registration desk and proceeded toward the General Assembly Hall. The interior of the Assembly Hall was breathtaking. The dome ceiling and the vast circular seating arrangement conveyed a profound sense of global importance. Chloe walked down the carpeted aisle toward the main stage, preparing for her scheduled sound check. The technicians adjusted the microphone heights, guiding the young speakers through the acoustic testing. I took a seat in the lower gallery, watching my daughter stand at the podium. She looked tiny against the imposing golden backdrop, yet her presence filled the space. She tapped the microphone, verifying the audio feedback. A sudden shift in the ambient noise drew my attention toward the upper spectator gallery. The heavy oak doors at the top of the tiered seating swung open. Two figures stepped into the dimly lit aisle, pausing to survey the expansive room. My breath caught in my throat. Richard and Evelyn walked down the carpeted stairs. They wore their finest tailored clothing, projecting an aura of effortless wealth and unquestionable authority. They had not accepted their defeat in Atlanta. They had boarded a private flight crossing the country to ensure their presence was felt on the final battlefield. They took their seats in the front row of the spectator gallery, looking directly down at the podium. Chloe finished adjusting her notes and looked up toward the audience section. I watched her eyes widen as she registered their faces. The final psychological siege had begun. The General Assembly Hall of the United Nations is designed to dwarf the individual. Its towering gold backdrop and sweeping circular seating enforce a sense of global gravity. Standing at the podium, a speaker is meant to feel the weight of the world. Yet, as Chloe completed her microphone check and looked up into the spectator gallery, the only weight she felt was the suffocating gravity of Buckhead, Georgia. Richard and Evelyn sat in the front row of the upper tier. They did not wave. They did not offer encouraging smiles. They sat with rigid, calculated stillness. Evelyn wore a pristine white suit, her hands folded neatly in her lap, projecting the image of a disappointed monarch. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the balcony railing, his gaze fixed on my daughter like a predator evaluating a cornered target. Their physical presence was a tactical maneuver. They had crossed state lines to remind a teenager that their authority recognized no borders. Chloe stepped down from the stage, her posture stiffening as she walked down the carpeted side aisle toward the backstage holding area. I moved to intercept her, noting the sudden pallor of her skin. Before I could reach her, a young page in a blue United Nations uniform approached from the opposite corridor. He held a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. The page offered a polite nod and handed the card directly to Chloe. He turned and disappeared into the bustling crowd of delegates and stagehands. I reached her side just as she unfolded the heavy paper. I recognized the embossed monogram on the back instantly. It was Evelyn's personal stationery, the same paper she used to dictate dress codes and enforce dinner party etiquette. Chloe stared at the handwritten script, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. I stepped closer, reading the ink over her shoulder. The note contained a single devastating sentence: "Don't embarrass your father. He has nothing left." The cruelty of the message lay in its precise targeting. Financial extortion was blunt, but this was a surgical strike aimed directly at my daughter's conscience. David had sacrificed his consulting firm, his inheritance, and his standing in the community to protect her right to speak. Evelyn and Richard were now twisting that sacrifice into a weapon of guilt. They wanted Chloe to believe that stepping onto the international stage was an act of profound selfishness that would only deepen her father's ruin. Chloe looked down at her hands. Her fingers were trembling, the thick cardstock vibrating in her grip. The psychological warfare was working. The confident, fierce debater who had navigated airport security and dismantled hostile opponents was fracturing under the weight of weaponized family loyalty. She closed her eyes, and I could see the sudden, overwhelming urge to surrender washing over her. I did not offer empty reassurances. I took her by the elbow and guided her away from the chaotic flow of the staging area. We ducked behind a heavy velvet curtain, finding a secluded alcove near the lighting technician panels. The space was dim and quiet, insulated from the murmuring crowd outside. "I cannot do this to him," Chloe whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Grandma is right. Dad lost his entire business because I refused to stay quiet. If I go out there and deliver this speech, Grandpa will never forgive him. I am destroying his life." I set my leather tote bag on a nearby equipment crate. As a grant writer, I spend my life dealing in documented evidence. When a narrative begins to unravel, you do not rely on emotion. You rely on artifacts. You ground the truth in tangible proof. I unzipped the inner compartment of my bag and pulled out a clear plastic sleeve. I had kept it hidden since the night of the Buckhead dinner. Inside the protective casing were the index cards Chloe had written weeks ago. The paper was warped, dried into rigid wrinkles, and stained with deep, illegible blue smears where the sweet tea had ruined her ink. I held the plastic sleeve up, catching the faint light of the alcove. "Look at these," I said, keeping my tone firm and anchored. "Your grandmother did not spill a drink by accident. She intentionally destroyed hours of your hard work because your ambition threatened her control. Your grandfather did not pull your father's business contracts because of a speech. He pulled them because he requires strict submission, and David finally chose freedom instead." Chloe stared at the ruined flashcards, the physical evidence of their initial sabotage, bringing the reality of the situation back into focus. "They have been trying to drown your voice since day one," I told her, my eyes locked onto hers. "They want you to feel small. They want you to carry the blame for their vindictive actions. But you are not responsible for their cruelty, Chloe. Today, you are the ocean. You are going to wash away every lie they told about you." I watched the transformation happen in real time. The trembling in her hands ceased. The guilt that Evelyn had tried to inject into her veins burned away, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. Chloe reached out and touched the plastic sleeve, acknowledging the artifact of her survival. She took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of her tailored navy blazer. The frightened teenager disappeared, leaving behind a competent, unyielding professional, ready to command a global audience. "I am ready," she said, her voice dropping into an authoritative register. "Stay here and review your opening remarks," I instructed her. "I am going to check the perimeter." I slipped out from behind the velvet curtain and walked back out into the main concourse. The delegates were lining up for the opening procession, but my focus remained on the peripheral threats. I scanned the outer lobby, looking for any further attempts at interference. Through the glass partitions separating the assembly hall from the press pavilion, I spotted Richard. He was not sitting in the gallery with his wife. He was standing in a secluded corner of the media lounge, speaking with a prominent journalist from a well-known conservative news network. I recognized the reporter from her evening broadcasts, which often championed traditional corporate values. Richard held a sleek leather folder. He handed a printed document to the journalist, adopting an expression of solemn paternal sorrow. He was actively lobbying the press. He was distributing the fabricated narrative that Chloe was a troubled, rebellious youth acting out against a loving family. He was pre-spinning her upcoming remarks, attempting to frame her international debut as a tragic mental health episode that his firm officially disavowed. He was trying to build a cage of public opinion to trap her the moment she stepped off the stage. I turned away from the glass partition, refusing to let his desperate maneuvering distract me from the immediate goal. The press would have to wait. The truth was about to be spoken on a microphone that reached far beyond Richard's wealth. I walked back into the staging area just as the overhead loudspeaker crackled to life. A crisp, automated voice echoed through the cavernous hall, announcing the next sequence of global youth delegates. Representing the United States of America, speaking on the structural barriers to global educational equity, please welcome Chloe Alexandra. The heavy double doors leading to the main stage swung open, revealing the brilliant, blinding wash of the spotlight. I stepped back, fading into the shadows of the wings. Chloe did not look back at me. She did not hesitate. She walked forward with precise, measured steps, leaving the quiet alcove behind and stepping into the light, ready to deliver the speech of her life. The interior of the General Assembly Hall is a monument to global discourse, defined by towering green marble walls and the iconic gold emblem rising behind the central stage. The vast, cavernous space felt a universe away from Buckhead. The affluent suburbs of Georgia were built on exclusionary country clubs, whispered agreements, and the rigid enforcement of quiet compliance. This room was engineered for loud, unapologetic truth. Chloe approached the curved wooden podium. The blinding stage lights caught the navy fabric of her tailored suit. She placed her unedited notes onto the slanted surface and tapped the microphone once to ensure the feed was active. She raised her chin and scanned the tiered spectator gallery. She located the front row of the upper balcony. Richard did not remain seated. As Chloe adjusted her stance, my father-in-law stood up. He stepped to the edge of the railing and crossed his arms over his chest. It was a calculated physical posture, a final silent command to yield. He wanted his towering presence to remind her of the frozen bank accounts, the revoked business contracts, and the ruined canvas backpack. He wanted her to feel the crushing weight of his disapproval, just seconds before she spoke to the world. Chloe let her gaze rest on him for a single defining heartbeat. She did not lower her eyes, she did not tremble. She looked right through him, treating the architect of our family ruin like a minor smudge on a glass window. She turned her attention to the assembly. "Honorable delegates," she began, her voice resonating clear and steady through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We gather today under the assumption that the future belongs to the youth, yet we operate within systems designed by legacy institutions that actively fear our voices." She did not read directly from a script. She delivered her arguments from memory, fueled by the intense friction of the last 12 months. She laid out a staggering, irrefutable case for global educational access. She dismantled the concept of education as a charitable afterthought, framing it instead as the fundamental economic infrastructure of any functioning society. She wove in the subtle, devastating subtext of her own lived experience without ever naming her grandparents. She spoke of entrenched power structures that demand silence in exchange for financial security. She described the systemic suppression of emerging leaders by those desperate to maintain a comfortable, unchallenged legacy. Every word was sharp, every transition was flawless. She delivered the exact, unvarnished truth that Richard had tried to discard into a dining room trash bin. I watched the international delegates on the floor. Translators leaned into their earpieces, working frantically to capture her rhythmic cadence. Pens stopped scratching across leather-bound notepads. The sprawling room fell into a profound, captivated stillness. She was not just a teenager delivering a prepared essay. She was a professional orator holding a global audience in the palm of her hand. She reached her conclusion, delivering a final, ringing call to action that challenged every dignitary in the room to dismantle the barricades they had built around their own privilege. She thanked the assembly and stepped back from the podium. The silence held for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the entire floor of the General Assembly rose. The applause started as a ripple and swelled into a deafening roar. It was a genuine, thunderous standing ovation. Chloe gathered her notes and walked down the carpeted stairs, exiting the main stage. The adrenaline radiated from her posture. I moved toward the central aisle to meet her, but the battlefield shifted before I could cross the velvet rope. A woman in a sharp red trench coat stepped out from behind a structural column blocking Chloe's path to the green room. It was the conservative journalist Richard had cornered in the media lounge 20 minutes earlier. A camera operator materialized right behind her, hoisting a heavy lens onto his shoulder. The red recording light illuminated instantly. The journalist shoved a foam-covered microphone directly toward Chloe's face, bypassing all standard diplomatic press protocols. "Chloe, Alexandra," the reporter said, her tone sharp and accusatory, intended to put a high school student on the defensive. "You just delivered a searing critique of legacy wealth and structural inequality, yet you come from one of the most prominent real estate development families in the American South. Does your wealthy family support these socialist education views, or is this simply a phase of privileged, youthful rebellion?" It was a beautifully laid trap. If Chloe defended her family, she sounded like a hypocrite. If she attacked them, she sounded like an ungrateful, erratic teenager, proving the exact narrative Richard had circulated in his drafted press release. I froze in the aisle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew better than to step in. Intervening would only provide the reporter with footage of a controlling stage mother dragging her fragile child away from a tough question. This was Chloe's fight. She stopped walking. She looked at the microphone, then up at the journalist. She did not flush with anger. She anchored herself in the tactical discipline of a championship debater. "Let us clarify the terminology before we address the premise," Chloe said, her voice remaining cool level and deeply authoritative. "Labeling equitable resource allocation as a socialist ideology is a deliberate mischaracterization. It is a rhetorical tactic utilized by entrenched institutions to avoid discussing their own monopolized advantages." The journalist blinked, her practiced smile faltering slightly. She had expected a flustered teenager. She was currently facing a titanium wall. Chloe stepped closer to the microphone, claiming the frame of the camera. "My grandfather built a formidable real estate empire in Atlanta. Because of that upbringing, I understand the mechanics of capital and leverage perfectly. I am not rebelling against my background. I am applying the analytical skills my education provided to point out a fundamental inefficiency. A child's zip code should not determine their basic literacy. Acknowledging that reality does not make someone a radical. It makes them observant. If demanding a functional, literate global workforce offends the sensibilities of legacy wealth, then perhaps those institutions should reevaluate the fragility of their own foundations." The reporter stood speechless. Her planned follow-up questions evaporated under the weight of flawless logic. Chloe offered a polite professional nod, stepped around the silent journalist, and continued walking toward the green room. I looked across the lobby through the glass partition of the press pavilion. Richard stood frozen near the coffee station. His face was drawn, his posture rigid. He had watched the entire exchange unfold on the live feed monitors. He realized his corporate media ambush had just backfired on a spectacular scale. By the time we reached the safety of the backstage holding area, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly in my purse. The network had broadcast the interaction live on their digital feed. Within 30 minutes, a major international news agency clipped the exchange, highlighting the exact moment Chloe dismantled the loaded question. The footage began propagating across every social platform. It was shared, analyzed, and applauded globally. The in-laws had spent 12 months trying to suppress her voice. They froze bank accounts, destroyed notes, and lobbied powerful executives. Yet their final attempt to humiliate her provided the exact friction needed to ignite a wildfire. They had not silenced her. They had given her the ultimate amplifier. By the time we returned to the quiet sanctuary of our boutique hotel, the digital landscape had shifted entirely. The brief, intense exchange outside the General Assembly Hall bypassed the standard diplomatic news cycles and ignited a global conversation. My daughter's articulate deconstruction of the hostile reporter resonated across multiple continents. 3 distinct international news agencies embedded the clip directly onto their digital front pages. They highlighted her unyielding composure and her precise dissection of structural inequality. Chloe sat on the edge of her hotel bed, scrolling through a social media timeline that refreshed faster than the eye could follow. She watched the notifications cascade down her screen, yet she remained remarkably grounded. The validation of the global community did not alter her focus. She simply closed the application, set the phone on the wooden nightstand, and opened her history textbook to study. The international praise was merely a byproduct of her truth, not the objective. While Chloe studied in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, my own device began a relentless buzzing vibration on the writing desk. The screen illuminated with a ceaseless barrage of incoming text messages. I picked up the phone and reviewed the sender identities. The names belonged to the very same Buckhead socialites who had spent the past month whispering about Chloe's fabricated mental instability. The women who had politely excluded us from charity luncheons and nodded in sympathetic agreement with Evelyn's vicious rumors were now rushing to claim proximity to success. I read a message from the country club membership director praising Chloe's undeniable brilliance. I received another from a state senator's wife, the same woman who had personally distributed the watered-down fake speech at the send-off dinner, claiming she always knew our girl was a star. The hollow congratulations piled up, a testament to the superficial currency of our former social circle. They did not care about global education or youth advocacy. They cared about alignment with power. I did not respond to a single message. I archived the threads, watching the shallow praise vanish into a digital void. I understood the mechanics of their sudden warmth. They were attempting to rewrite history to ensure they ended up on the winning side. The true depth of that historical revision became apparent an hour later. David sat in the armchair by the window, his laptop resting on his knees. He was streaming a local Atlanta evening news broadcast to monitor the regional reaction to the viral clip. The anchor transitioned to a segment highlighting the sensation originating from their own city. The screen cut to a live remote feed. Standing on the manicured front lawn of his sprawling estate, framed perfectly by the towering oak trees, was Richard. He wore a tailored navy blazer and a warm, benevolent smile. He looked directly into the camera lens with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician. The local reporter held a microphone toward him, asking how it felt to watch his granddaughter command such an immense global platform. Richard offered a soft, paternal chuckle. "It is a profound joy," he told the interviewer, his voice dripping with fabricated pride. "We have always encouraged Chloe to speak her mind. We nurtured her debate skills from a very young age. Watching her up there, challenging the status quo with such intellect, it just confirms everything we value in this family." He paused, letting his smile widen, ensuring the camera captured his manufactured warmth. "She gets that fire from our side of the family. We could not be more thrilled." I stood in the center of the hotel room, the air turning heavy in my lungs. I watched the man who had legally attempted to seize my child, who had weaponized a private security contractor to ground our flight, and who had bankrupted his own son, stand on television and claim ownership of the triumph he had spent 12 months trying to destroy. David stared at the screen, his face draining of color. Growing up under Richard's roof meant operating under the illusion that the cruelty always served a higher logical purpose. That illusion shattered permanently in that quiet hotel room. David did not express immediate rage. He expressed a profound, chilling disgust. He reached out and closed the laptop, cutting off the feed with a sharp snap. "He is a sociopath," David whispered, staring at the blank, metallic casing of the computer. "He possesses no core. He just manipulates whatever reality serves him best." I looked at my husband, witnessing the final veil drop from his eyes. The realization was painful, but it was essential for his freedom. A cold, quiet resolve settled into my chest. Anger is a volatile fuel prone to burning out or causing collateral damage. Resolve is structural. It builds foundations. Richard assumed our silence was guaranteed. He calculated that we would simply accept our independence and fade into the background, allowing him to absorb Chloe's victory into his corporate mythology. He believed his wealth shielded him from consequences. He calculated wrong. I walked over to the small writing desk and opened my own computer. As a nonprofit grant writer, my entire professional existence is dedicated to compiling undeniable evidence. I build airtight cases to secure funding, utilizing data metadata and sequential timelines. I decided to apply that exact methodology to the man who thought he could steal my daughter's courage. I created a new encrypted folder on my desktop. I titled it with the name of Richard's real estate development firm. Into that folder, I dragged the digital receipt verifying Evelyn's signature on the intercepted United Nations acceptance letter. I scanned and uploaded the fraudulent unfiled conservatorship petition drafted by Richard's corporate legal team, highlighting the date stamps. I converted the aggressive loan recall demand into a pristine digital document, marking the predatory clauses and the timestamp proving it was executed the morning after Chloe refused to yield her voice. I included the anonymous email containing the drafted press release intended to smear her character on the global stage. I even uploaded high-resolution photographs of the tea-stained debate notes, preserving the physical artifact of their initial sabotage. I assembled the ultimate dossier. It was a sequential, undeniable record of financial extortion, medical fabrication, and psychological warfare. It was the truth backed by a flawless paper trail that no amount of public relations spin could erase. I opened my digital contact directory. During my years securing grants for community initiatives, I had crossed paths with a dedicated investigative journalist based in Atlanta. She possessed a reputation for dissecting corporate corruption and harbored no fear of legacy wealth. She had spent years trying to penetrate the polished exterior of Richard's development board without success. I found her direct mobile number. I checked the time. It was late in the evening on the East Coast, but a journalist chasing a foundational story rarely sleeps. I picked up my phone and dialed the digits. The line rang 3 times before she answered, her voice sharp and alert. I did not offer small talk. I spoke with the precise, measured tone of a woman who holds the winning hand. I have a documented timeline detailing severe financial coercion, mail tampering, and a fabricated medical smear campaign orchestrated by Richard's firm, I told her, staring out the window at the glittering New York skyline. The target of this campaign was his own granddaughter. I have the legal drafts, the financial demands, and the digital signatures. Are you interested in the real story behind the viral video? The journalist remained silent for a fraction of a second, processing the magnitude of the offer. I am listening, she replied. I pulled a chair out from the desk and sat down. The silent daughter-in-law was finally ready to speak. The public reckoning was about to begin. The descent into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport felt remarkably different than our frantic departure just days earlier. We traded the towering electric energy of New York City for the familiar humidity of the American South. Yet as we walked through the bustling arrival terminal, the air lacked the suffocating weight it had carried my entire adult life. We retrieved our luggage and navigated the concourse, not as outcasts fleeing a family dynasty, but as quiet victors, returning to claim our own space. Chloe carried her debate binder with a relaxed, confident grip. David walked with his shoulders pulled back, the perpetual tension in his jaw finally softening. We had survived the gauntlet, and we drove back to our quiet suburban house, ready to face the aftermath. The in-laws were already attempting to control the narrative. Realizing that Chloe possessed a globally recognized platform, Evelyn moved swiftly to capitalize on the viral momentum. She utilized her extensive digital network, crafting a lengthy, fawning post on a prominent community social platform. She announced a lavish welcome reception to be held at the Buckhead estate, designed to celebrate the brilliant young delegate. She tagged local politicians, charity board directors, and influential neighbors, ensuring the invitation served as a public declaration of family unity. It was a digital snare, an attempt to force us into a photo opportunity that would rewrite their 12 months of sabotage. I sat at our kitchen island, reading the notification on my tablet. I did not feel the familiar surge of panic. I felt a cool, detached clarity. I did not type an angry rebuttal. I crafted a public response using the same lethal politeness she wielded at her dinner parties. I replied directly to the public thread. Thank you for the thought, Evelyn. Chloe is prioritizing her upcoming college applications and requires undisturbed rest after her travels. We will decline the reception, but we appreciate your sudden support. The boundary was set, visible to every affluent member of their social circle. I exposed the abruptness of her affection, turning her performative hospitality into a glaring display of hypocrisy. The true reckoning arrived early Tuesday morning. The investigative journalist I had contacted from our hotel room spent 72 painstaking hours verifying the digital ledger. She cross-referenced the unfiled court petitions, authenticated the timestamps on the bank demands, and traced the metadata on the forged press release. She did not rush the publication for a quick headline. She built an ironclad, unassailable narrative. The piece went live on the digital front page of a highly respected regional publication just as the Atlanta Financial District opened for business. The headline was clinical, objective, and devastating. It did not focus on teenage rebellion or familial disputes. It focused on corporate extortion. The article detailed the exact mechanisms Richard utilized to control his family, framing his actions not as private matters, but as a direct reflection of his foundational business ethics. The journalist embedded the raw receipts directly into the text of the article. Readers could scroll past the narrative and view the predatory clauses embedded in David's consulting loan. They saw the explicit punishing interest structures designed to enforce bankruptcy rather than foster independent growth. It laid bare the financial coercion used to keep a grown man tethered to his father's desk. Further down the page, the article displayed a redacted copy of the unfiled conservatorship petition. The chilling attempt to fabricate a medical crisis to seize a dissenting teenager was presented for the public to read. The journalist expertly tied the document to the whisper campaign Evelyn had waged across the country club dining rooms. The article even named the corporate crisis manager sent to the United Nations, proving Richard used company resources and payroll to execute a personal vendetta against a high school student. The evidence was undeniable, backed by paper trails, digital signatures, and unyielding metadata. In the affluent enclaves of Buckhead, traditional respectability functions as the ultimate currency. Wealthy investors will tolerate ruthless boardroom tactics, but they despise public messiness. Extorting your own teenage granddaughter crosses a line from calculated capitalism into profound moral decay. The same socialites who had eagerly whispered about Chloe's mental health now read the unsealed financial ledgers over their morning coffee. The town that had judged my family for years suddenly saw the precise blueprint of our survival. The illusion of the benevolent patriarch shattered, replaced by the documented reality of a predator. My phone remained silent, free from the hollow congratulations that had flooded my screen in New York. However, David's industry contacts began to reach out. They did not offer pity. They offered quiet respect for a man who walked away from a toxic empire. The social dynamics of the city inverted overnight. The people who once feared Richard's influence now sought to distance themselves from his toxic exposure. Richard's real estate firm entered immediate, frantic crisis management. The corporate public relations team scrambled to issue categorical denials, but they could not argue with authenticated document files and digital signatures floating across the internet. The investors started making phone calls. The foundational partners of his development board, men who valued a pristine public image above all else, balked at the exposure. They did not want their capital associated with a man who weaponized the legal system against his own blood. The boardroom, once a stronghold of Richard's unquestioned authority, fractured under the weight of the scandal. The definitive blow landed 48 hours after the article published. Richard's firm had spent 2 years lobbying for a lucrative commercial zoning contract with the County Planning Commission. It was the crown jewel of his real estate portfolio, a project projected to yield unprecedented revenue and cement his legacy in the region. The commission held an emergency session on Thursday afternoon, citing severe concerns over corporate governance, ethical leadership, and the devastating public optics. The county formally withdrew their recommendation. They awarded the project to a competing developer. Richard lost his defining contract not because someone raised their voice or threw a tantrum in his grand foyer. He lost his empire because I kept the paperwork. The carefully constructed facade of the invincible Southern gentleman crumbled entirely. It fell not from shouting, but from the quiet, lethal application of precise, undeniable documentation. The trap he spent decades building had finally collapsed, and we were standing safely outside the blast radius. The loss of the commercial zoning contract cornered my father-in-law. Men who build their identities on unyielding control do not retreat when their authority shatters. They retaliate. Desperate to regain the narrative and stabilize his plummeting business reputation, Richard launched a final legal offensive. The opening maneuver arrived quietly in our mailbox. It was a thick, textured envelope addressed directly to Chloe. The return address bore Evelyn's elegant monogram. I placed it on the kitchen island, allowing my daughter to make her own decision regarding the correspondence. Chloe broke the seal with a steady hand and unfolded the heavy stationery. I watched her read. Evelyn had deployed a masterclass in emotional extortion. The letter abandoned the haughty condescension of the Buckhead estate, replacing it with a tearful, manipulative plea. Evelyn wrote that the public scandal had devastated her grandfather's health. She claimed Richard was suffering from severe cardiac stress, enduring sleepless nights due to the intense pressure of the media fallout. The letter begged Chloe to issue a public statement of forgiveness, urging her to retract the narrative to save the family from further ruin. Evelyn framed the request as a desperate attempt to save an ailing man. A year ago, that letter would have crushed my daughter. It would have triggered a cascade of guilt and obedience. Today, it was just ink on paper. Chloe read the final paragraph, her expression remaining entirely neutral. She did not shed a tear. She did not ask for my advice. She calmly folded the stationery, walked over to her filing cabinet, and slipped the letter into a folder labeled with her grandfather's name. She shut the drawer, sealing away the manipulation, and returned to her college application essays without uttering a single word. Her resilience had crystallized. The emotional manipulation failed. 48 hours later, the legal assault began. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A nondescript sedan pulled into our driveway. A man wearing a beige windbreaker walked up our front steps and rang the doorbell. David opened the door. The man confirmed his identity, handed over a dense, intimidating stack of legal filings bound by heavy blue clips, and walked away. David brought the documents into the kitchen. We stood together reading the formal petitions. Richard had retained a high-profile litigation firm to serve us with a defamation lawsuit. The filing was staggering in its scope. Richard claimed that the documents published by the investigative journalist were elaborate forgeries orchestrated by disgruntled family members seeking financial leverage. The lawsuit demanded an immediate public retraction and sought exorbitant punitive damages intended to ruin us. The cruelty did not stop with the defamation charge. The second document was a formal injunction aimed directly at Chloe. Richard filed a legal motion to seize her remaining college trust fund. To justify the seizure, his lawyers invoked an obscure, archaic morality clause buried deep within the original trust charter. They argued that Chloe had violated the terms of the trust by publicly slandering her own family, thereby forfeiting her right to the educational capital. He was trying to erase her future to punish her defiance. The strategy was clear. He intended to bury us under a mountain of legal fees, forcing us into submission through sheer financial exhaustion. We sat in the modest downtown office of our own attorney the following morning. Gregory was a pragmatic, sharp litigator who understood the intricate realities of Georgia politics. He reviewed the thick stack of filings, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the magnitude of Richard's counterattack. Rain lashed against the window pane, mirroring the grim atmosphere inside the room. Gregory set the documents on his desk and folded his hands. He did not offer false comfort. He delivered the stark truth of our situation. The defamation claim is baseless. Gregory explained, his voice low and serious. We have the metadata. We have the original copies. We can prove the authenticity of the leaked documents. The problem is not the truth. The problem is the venue. He leaned forward, holding David's gaze. This lawsuit was filed in a local county court. Your father has spent 3 decades cultivating relationships in this specific jurisdiction. He donates to judicial campaigns. He plays golf with the magistrates. He knows how to stall the docket request, endless evidentiary hearings, and drag this process out for years. David stiffened in his chair. The anxiety that had begun to fade over the past week surged back into his posture. Fighting him in this arena will require immense resources, Gregory continued, outlining the grim reality. We are talking about depositions, expert witnesses to verify the digital trails, and constant motion practice. He wants a war of attrition. He knows you are operating on finite, independent savings. He intends to bankrupt you before a judge ever hears the actual merits of the case. The silence in the office felt heavier than the rain outside. The legal system, much like the elite social circles of Buckhead, was built to favor those with the deepest pockets. Richard was weaponizing the court to drain the emergency fund I had spent a decade building. I listened to the attorney outline our impending ruin. I did not flinch. During my years as a grant writer, I learned that when an opponent controls the playing field, you do not play their game. You change the jurisdiction. I opened my leather briefcase. When I first audited David's business records to protect our assets, I did not stop at the predatory loan terms. I traced the capital. I analyzed the specific mechanisms Richard used to disperse the funds and structure the repayment schedules. My professional expertise lies in forensic accounting, tracking institutional money to ensure federal compliance. I had applied that exact scrutiny to my father-in-law's private ledgers. I pulled a single, unadorned manila folder from my briefcase. I rested my hands on the smooth cardboard. "Richard assumes we will defend ourselves against his civil claims," I said, my voice cutting through the tension in the room. "He assumes we are terrified of a local judge, but his confidence relies on the belief that his financial structures are secure. They are not." Gregory tilted his head, watching me with sudden, intense focus. David turned toward me, confusion replacing his dread. "When I reviewed the original loan agreement Richard used to trap David," I explained, maintaining a slow, deliberate cadence, "I discovered that the capital was not drawn from a standard corporate account. It was routed through a series of shell entities designed to shield the principal from corporate tax liabilities. The interest structures were engineered to report phantom losses. He is moving vast amounts of unregistered capital across state lines under the guise of familial investments." I paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the desk. "It is not just predatory," I stated clearly. "It is a severe, systemic violation of the federal tax code." I slid the manila folder across the polished wood of the desk. It stopped directly in front of Gregory. The folder contained the pristine, audited proof of a comprehensive tax evasion scheme. "We don't need to worry about his influence in the local county courts," I told our attorney, watching the realization dawn in his eyes. "We don't need a local judge. We're going to the IRS." The neutral ground of a downtown Atlanta mediation room offers no home field advantage. Gregory secured a conference space on the 40th floor of a glass high-rise far removed from the country clubs and private golf courses where my father-in-law usually dictated terms. The room smelled of ozone and fresh coffee. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the space, flanked by ergonomic black leather chairs. David sat to my right, his posture straight, his hands resting on the cool wood. He had spent his entire life bracing for his father's wrath. Today, he was merely an observer to the dismantling of an empire. The heavy glass doors swung open. Richard walked in wearing his signature bespoke charcoal suit. He was flanked by two high-priced corporate litigators. These men wore silk ties and carried thick leather briefcases. They projected an aura of invincible authority. They took their seats across from us. Richard did not look at David. He did not look at me. He stared at the blank wall behind Gregory's head, conveying his profound disdain for the proceedings. The lead litigator cleared his throat and opened a thick binder. He began the meeting with the rehearsed cadence of a man accustomed to forcing swift capitulations. He referenced the defamation lawsuit, outlining the ruinous punitive damages they intended to pursue. He mentioned the injunction against Chloe's trust fund, leaning heavily on the archaic morality clause. He spoke of protracted discovery phases, endless depositions, and the financial exhaustion we would face if we refused to sign their proposed retraction and surrender the rights to my daughter's educational capital. Gregory let the man speak for 4 uninterrupted minutes. My attorney did not take notes. He did not object. He waited until the litigator finished his opening salvo and leaned back in his chair, expecting us to fold. The silence stretched across the polished table. Gregory reached into his slim briefcase and pulled out the single, unadorned manila folder I had prepared. He did not slide a thick binder across the wood. He slid 10 pieces of paper. "My clients will not be signing a retraction," Gregory said, his voice quiet and even. "We will not be responding to the defamation suit in county court. We will not be contesting the trust injunction. If you choose to proceed with civil litigation, we will submit a different set of documents to a different jurisdiction." The lead litigator offered a condescending smirk. "You have no alternate jurisdiction, Gregory. This is a local civil matter." "It was a local civil matter," Gregory corrected him, tapping a finger on the manila folder, "until my client conducted a forensic audit of the initial capitalization structure your client used to fund his son's consulting firm. Please turn to page 3. The opposing counsel opened the folder, his smirk faltering as his eyes scanned the top sheet. You will notice the routing numbers. Gregory continued the surgical precision of his delivery, leaving no room for argument. The capital provided to David did not originate from a domestic corporate account. It was routed through a series of offshore shell entities. Your client engineered the interest structures to report phantom losses on his domestic filings. He utilized familial investments to launder unregistered capital and evade corporate tax liabilities across state lines. I watched the lead litigator read the breakdown. The color drained from his face in a sudden, visible rush. His eyes darted from the spreadsheets to the attached metadata I had meticulously compiled. He recognized the irrefutable nature of the evidence. These were not emotional allegations. These were federal tax violations documented in cold black ink. Richard noticed the shift in his attorney's posture. He leaned over, attempting to look at the papers. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice tightening. "It is fabricated nonsense. They are bluffing." The litigator put his hand over the documents, physically blocking his own client from the files. He turned to Richard, and the deferential tone he had used moments ago vanished. "Do not speak," the lawyer told Richard, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The dynamic in the room inverted in the span of 10 seconds. The threat of a local judge sympathetic to Richard's wealth meant nothing. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division does not care about Buckhead Country Club memberships. They care about federal statutes. Richard's lawyers realized they were sitting in a room with evidence of a federal crime, and they knew their ethical obligation was to shield themselves from their client's liability. The lead counsel closed the manila folder. He looked at Gregory, his earlier arrogance replaced by the grim professionalism of a man negotiating terms of surrender. "What are your terms?" the litigator asked. Gregory slid a pre-drafted settlement agreement across the table. I had worked with him late into the night to ensure every clause was airtight. First, the immediate and permanent emancipation of David's consulting firm from any financial umbrella controlled by your client, Gregory stated. All purported debts are forgiven and nullified. Second, the college trust fund originally designated for Chloe Alexandra is to be released from all fiduciary oversight today. The funds will be transferred to an independent account under her direct control, free of any morality clauses or discretionary revocation rights. Third, an irrevocable non-disclosure agreement preventing your client from ever discussing my clients, their businesses, or their daughter in any public or private forum. Gregory paused, letting his eyes lock onto Richard. And finally, a strict, binding non-contact order. You do not call, you do not send mail, you do not approach them. Richard stared at the settlement document. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He was a man who had spent his entire life purchasing submission, and he was now being forced to purchase his own freedom at the cost of his empire's control. He looked at David, expecting to find the frightened boy who always yielded. He found a man looking back at him with unblinking resolve. "Sign it," his lead attorney instructed, handing Richard a silver pen. "If they forward that audit to the federal authorities, you are facing a custodial sentence. Sign the paper, Richard." The patriarch of the family picked up the pen. His hand shook. The tremor was slight, but it was undeniable. He placed the nib against the crisp white paper and signed his name, severing his control over his son and his granddaughter to save himself from federal prison. He traded his family for his legal survival. The severance was total. We left the conference room without another word. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor, stepping out into the humid Georgia afternoon. The recent rain had left the pavement slick, the air smelling of wet asphalt. We walked toward the parking garage. Standing next to our car, holding a designer umbrella, was Evelyn. She had waited outside, unaware of the structural collapse that had just occurred on the 40th floor. She saw David approaching and immediately launched into her final desperate performance. Her eyes welled with tears. She reached out her hands trembling as she stepped toward her son. "David, please," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "You cannot do this to us. The lawsuits, the anger, it is tearing us apart. We are your family. We just want to protect you. We just want things to go back to the way they were." She reached for his arm, seeking the familiar purchase of his guilt. David didn't step back. He stood his ground, looking down at the woman who had orchestrated the destruction of his daughter's debate notes, who had attempted to steal medical records, and who had smiled while his business was liquidated at a dinner party. He looked at her not with anger, but with the quiet pity reserved for strangers. "Family doesn't keep score," David said, his voice echoing in the concrete structure of the parking garage. "You taught me that." He turned away from her, opened the driver's side door, and got into the car. I walked around the front bumper, meeting Evelyn's shocked, frozen stare for one final second. I offered her a polite, silent nod and climbed into the passenger seat. As we pulled out of the parking structure, I looked in the side mirror. Richard had emerged from the building. He walked over to his wife. They stood alone on the damp pavement, two figures surrounded by the wealth they had prioritized above all else. They climbed into the back of their waiting town car, the tinted windows rolling up to seal them inside their silent, empty world. The trap they spent 18 years building had officially snapped shut on them, leaving us to drive toward the light. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of my home office, casting long golden rectangles across the polished hardwood floor. The space felt remarkably different today. For the past 12 months, this room had served as a fortified bunker. It was the tactical center where I audited financial records, tracked intercepted mail, and compiled the airtight evidence that ultimately saved my family from ruin. Now the tension had evaporated, leaving behind a simple, quiet room. I folded the cardboard flaps of a moving box and sealed it with a strip of clear packing tape. We were not moving out of our house, but we were systematically clearing out the toxic remnants of a past life. I lifted the thick binders containing David's old corporate incorporation filings and placed them into the bottom of the box. Those contracts were nullified artifacts now. The consulting firm tethered to his father's suffocating capital no longer existed, and with its dissolution, a heavy shadow lifted from our home. David walked into the office carrying 2 ceramic mugs of green tea. He handed one to me and leaned comfortably against the edge of my desk. The physical transformation in my husband over the last month was nothing short of profound. The perpetual knot of anxiety that used to reside in his jaw had vanished entirely. His shoulders rested naturally free from the defensive posture he had maintained since childhood. Earlier this week, David signed a new consulting contract with an independent logistics firm based in a different time zone. The compensation was modest compared to the inflated leverage numbers his father used to manipulate him, but the revenue belonged entirely to him. He built this new foundation on his own merit, relying on his actual expertise rather than the conditional patronage of the Buckhead estate. He took a sip of his tea and smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed expression I had not seen since our early 20s. The fear of failure had been replaced by the quiet pride of autonomy. He was finally a free man. Down the hall, the sounds of shifting luggage and rustling fabric echoed from Chloe's bedroom. She was packing for her freshman year of college. She had selected a prestigious university on the West Coast, choosing to place 2,000 miles of geographic distance between her ambition and her grandparents' gated driveway. The financial logistics of her higher education were no longer a weapon held over her head. Following the strict settlement we forced in the downtown mediation room, the capital from her college trust fund transferred directly into an independent banking institution. Gregory, our attorney, ensured the new legal framework required only Chloe's signature for tuition disbursements and housing costs. She controlled her own ledger. The archaic morality clauses and the discretionary revocation rights were erased forever. I watched her from the doorway for a moment. She was learning to manage her wealth responsibly, attending virtual meetings with a neutral financial advisor, and understanding the mechanics of her own independence. She was no longer a pawn in a generational chess match. I left David in the office and walked into the kitchen to begin preparing dinner. I set my tablet on the marble island and tapped the screen to check the local evening news broadcast. The investigative article detailing the corporate extortion had left a permanent scar on the regional business landscape. The fallout was swift, structural, and undeniable. The news anchor introduced a segment on the shifting dynamics of the Atlanta real estate market. The screen cut to a live press conference. Richard sat at a long, unadorned table in front of a neutral gray backdrop. The vibrant, commanding patriarch who used to dominate country club dining rooms with a simple glance was gone. He looked aged, diminished, and hollowed out by the scandal. His bespoke charcoal suit seemed to hang loosely on his shrinking frame. Following the loss of the lucrative county zoning contract and the subsequent withdrawal of his primary institutional investors, the board of directors forced a rapid corporate restructuring. Richard stared into the camera lenses and read from a prepared, sanitized statement. He announced his early retirement from the firm he had spent decades building. He cited a sudden desire to spend more time focusing on private philanthropic endeavors, a hollow excuse everyone in the industry saw right through. He sat alone at that table. Evelyn was not seated beside him. There were no smiling politicians or eager developers standing behind him to offer their public support. The powerful allies who once flocked to his side had scattered, terrified of the toxic exposure his documented actions carried. He had traded his son and his granddaughter to maintain his polished, respectable image, and in the end, the image crumbled anyway. I watched him shuffle his papers and stand up, a solitary figure retreating into the shadows of his own making. I tapped the screen, turning off the video. I felt no pity, only the quiet closure of a finished chapter. I want to speak directly to anyone listening who understands the suffocating weight of a family that demands your silence in exchange for their affection. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into their picture. The people who truly value your presence will never ask you to water down your convictions or hide your brilliance to protect their fragile egos. The architects of conditional love rely on your fear to maintain their control. They weaponize guilt, they manipulate resources, and they count on you to remain polite while they dismantle your future behind closed doors. You must stop being polite to predators. You must start keeping the receipts. Document the reality of your situation, build a quiet sanctuary of financial and emotional independence, and recognize that setting a firm boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of survival. I walked over to the entryway console table. A large cardboard bin sat near the front door, designated for items we planned to donate to the local charity thrift store. I reached into a nearby tote bag and pulled out a heavy leather-bound volume. It was the gold-embossed etiquette book Evelyn had slid across the mahogany dining table 12 months ago. The vintage pages still carried the faint scent of dust and restrictive expectations. She had presented it as a manual for compliance, a tool to teach my daughter how to blend into the wallpaper, avoid making waves, and speak softly. I held the heavy book in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the weight of generations of silenced women bound within its rigid spine. I did not throw it in the trash. I simply dropped it into the donation bin. It landed with a soft, final thud among the discarded items. The spell was broken. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor behind me. I turned around. Chloe stood in the hallway, taking a break from packing her suitcases. She was not wearing the fragile pink dress her grandmother had tried to force upon her. She wore the sharp, tailored navy debate suit she had worn on the stage of the United Nations General Assembly. She had just retrieved the garment from the dry cleaners, holding it carefully before placing it into her travel bag. She looked at the donation bin, then looked up at me. Her posture was flawless. Her eyes held the bright, unyielding spark of a young woman who knew exactly what her voice was worth. She smiled, confident and entirely unburdened by the ghosts of Buckhead. They told me to teach my daughter to be quiet. Instead, I taught her to be undeniable, and the loudest room finally went still. There is a very specific, suffocating silence that settles over a formal dining table when the ghosts of past generations pull up a chair. It is not the comfortable, easy quiet of shared love or mutual understanding. It is the heavy, breathless pause of expectation. As parents, we are handed a fragile, profound responsibility the moment we first hold our children. We are tasked with the impossible labor of building their future while simultaneously carrying the heavy, ink-stained blueprints of our own past. In the traditional American family structure, this dual responsibility often creates a devastating collision. We are relentlessly conditioned to honor our roots, to respect the hierarchy of our elders, and to preserve the pristine legacy of our family name at all costs. But what happens when that legacy demands the shrinking of your child's soul? The story of Lauren and Chloe is not merely a dramatic recounting of a wealthy family feud. It is a pristine mirror reflecting the silent psychological battles fought in living rooms, kitchens, and holiday gatherings across the country. It forces us to confront the true, unvarnished definition of family responsibility and to measure the exact agonizing cost of conditional love. In American culture, particularly in regions deeply steeped in historical heritage, tradition is often presented as a warm, protective quilt. We teach our children manners, we teach them respect, and we teach them the value of a well-set table and a polite greeting. But the line between a foundational anchor and a gilded cage is remarkably, terrifyingly thin. When an etiquette book is slid across a mahogany table, not to teach a young woman grace, but to enforce her silence, tradition is no longer a cultural heirloom. It becomes a weapon of suppression. As parents, we must look at our own reflections with brutal honesty. We must ask ourselves, are we teaching our children to be respectful, or are we conditioning them to be compliant? There is a profound, universe-sized difference between the two. True respect is rooted in emotional awareness, empathy, and mutual understanding. Compliance is rooted entirely in fear. When we demand that our children suppress their internal moral compass, mute their burning passions, or wear clothing that masks their true identity, simply to keep the peace at a Sunday dinner, we are profoundly failing them. We are teaching them that their authentic self is a burden to the people who are supposed to love them most. A healthy, emotionally aware family structure uses its culture to give a child deep roots, but it never, under any circumstances, uses those roots to strangle the branches reaching for the sun. This dynamic extends dangerously into the realm of family economics. The accumulation of wealth, the promise of the college trust fund, the inheritance of the family business, these are the hallmarks of the American dream. We are conditioned to believe that providing financial security is the ultimate parental achievement. But money, when wielded without fairness or emotional maturity, is the most corrosive force in a family dynamic. The weaponization of a trust fund or a business loan serves as a dark cautionary tale about the currency of love. True family responsibility requires teaching children financial independence and emotional resilience. When an inheritance is used as a leash, it ceases to be a gift. It becomes a ransom note. As parents, guiding our children's long-term future, we must instill in them the unwavering belief that their personal integrity is worth infinitely more than a conditional safety net. If a child learns that their voice can be bought or that their silence is the price of admission to a comfortable life, we have completely bankrupted their character. We must model absolute fairness by ensuring that our support, both emotional and financial, is never held hostage to our own egos or the demands of our elders. Perhaps the most exhausting part of parenting within a rigid traditional family structure is the constant, suffocating temptation to act as a filter. It is so easy to pull a child aside in a hallway and whisper, "Just tone it down today," or "Please don't bring up your debate topic around your grandfather." We do it because we are exhausted. We do it because we desperately want to avoid the conflict, the passive-aggressive sighs, the ruined holidays, and the icy stares. But every single time we ask our child to filter themselves to protect an adult's fragile ego, we are betraying our primary duty. The choice to stand as a shield rather than a filter is the defining lesson of emotional awareness in modern parenting. Our children are always watching us. They see exactly when we cower to authority, and they see exactly when we stand tall. Protecting a child's authentic voice means being willing to take the blunt force of the family's disapproval directly onto your own shoulders. It means looking at the people who raised you, the people who feed you, and saying, "This stops with me." It requires a radical, fearless honesty to admit that the adults in the room are entirely wrong and the teenager is entirely right. You do not shrink a child to fit a comfortable antique frame. You break the frame to pieces. This brings us to the ultimate legacy a parent can leave. For generations, the American ideal of legacy has been tied to names carved into buildings, inherited estates, and undisturbed social reputations. But true evolution reveals a far more difficult and noble inheritance: the courage to walk away. Breaking generational trauma is not a loud cinematic explosion. It is a quiet, excruciating choice made in the stillness of a dining room or in the silent packing of a cardboard box. It is the heartbreaking realization that you cannot heal the people who broke you, but you can absolutely prevent them from breaking your children. This is the highest, most sacred form of family responsibility. It is standing in the wreckage of your own childhood conditioning and deciding that your child will inherit your strength, your defiance, and your truth, rather than your fear. We owe our children the honesty to admit our family's deep flaws and the fairness to protect them from the fallout. If this narrative echoes the quiet, hidden battles in your own life, if you have ever had to choose between keeping the family peace and keeping your own soul intact, you are not alone. There is a vast community of people who have learned that the loudest, most intimidating rooms can finally go completely still when you refuse to play by their rules. I invite you to join us on this journey. Please subscribe and follow the channel Revenge Order, where we will continue to explore the undeniable power of reclaiming your narrative, speaking your truth, and breaking the heavy chains of conditional love. Because in the end, when the grand houses are finally empty, when the trust funds are spent and the country club memberships expire, what actually remains of us, we spend our entire lives desperately trying to build a legacy, terrified of what the neighbors will think, of what the community will say, of how the portrait will look. But maybe the truest legacy isn't something you meticulously build at all. Maybe it is the thing you finally have the courage to walk away from. You close the heavy oak door on the house you grew up in. You step out into the fading, humid evening light, and you look at the people standing beside you in the driveway. And as the silence settles over the gravel, you wonder, were you finally leaving your family behind? Or were you, for the very first time in your life, actually becoming one?